Good evening, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to tonight's live stream from the Met Club. I'm John Sweeney, Club Treasurer, as well as your host for this evening. Tonight, we continue our Eco-Right series with Alex Flint, Executive Director of Alliance for Market Solutions, or AMS. We've heard from several Eco-Right leaders during this series, including Rich Powell of ClearPath, Heather Reams of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions, Quill Robinson of the American Conservation Coalition, and Bob Inglis of Republican. If you missed any of those episodes, I encourage you to go back and watch them at some point. All of these eco-right organizations share the view that reducing carbon emissions and promoting U.S. economic growth are not mutually exclusive, but rather go hand in hand. And they believe we can address climate change using market-based solutions that are consistent with conservative values rather than a massive government takeover of our economy through the Green New Deal. Their only real differences are on their policy prescriptions to achieve those goals. AMS is one of the few eco-right organizations that is focused primarily on placing a price on carbon emissions, or a carbon tax. How can a tax encourage economic growth? And what about this solution is at all conservative? Alex is here to talk us through it. He's a longtime Republican activist and Capitol Hill staffer. For a decade prior to joining AMS in 2017, Alex led governmental affairs at the Nuclear Energy Institute. He is recently named one of the 50 people changing the game in Washington by National Journal, as well as one of the 250 most influential people in Washington by Washingtonian Magazine. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. We're glad you're here. So Alex, I'd love to start with a little bit of background on you, where you're from, how you got involved in Republican politics, and how you ended up becoming so involved in the climate debate.
So I'm one of those kids. I started as an 18-year-old intern working in the U.S. Senate. I worked for the then chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, Pete Domenici, a Republican from New Mexico. By the time I'd been there about 8 years, I'd studied Soviet, I was a Sovietologist by training in college. I got a position on the Senate Appropriations Committee, and I was responsible for the budget of the U.S. nuclear weapons program. And for a number of years, I spent a lot of time with the scientists at the national laboratories. And while there was a lot going on and there wasn't a singular moment, I do remember an occasion. I was at Lawrence Livermore, and some of the weapons scientists there said, "Hey, we want to talk to you about something different. Come and take a look at some of this modeling that we've been doing about weather and about climate." And I remember very clearly, this was a group of people who I had a lot of respect for. These were folks deep into the nuclear weapons program. And what they said was, we are seeing changes in atmospheric chemistry. We are seeing gradual warming that will continue. We expect that will result in increased humidity and rain in the spring in California, which will result in increased growth in underbrush. But that by the summertime, because it's a little warmer, it will dry out. And there will be a tendency for there to be forest fires as all of that greenery turns to sort of brush and burns. And when we look at this long term, and the conversation just went on from there. And it was, for me, it was a group of people for whom I have tremendous regard. I certainly then was very close to the scientific community. I stayed in touch with the scientific community. And it was sort of a reality of our energy consumption. Emissions are an externality that were having a consequence, and we were beginning to see that reality. So since the mid-1990s, I've been a Republican. I'm conservative on a lot of issues. That's my grounding. Who has thought we have a problem here, and ignoring it or avoiding it does us no good. And for some period of time, that was kind of awkward. I was, for a while, not that I was famous, but I was known as a conservative Republican doing energy policy who thought climate change was happening and that we needed to do something about it, which was very different than a lot of the people that I was working with. I did a number of things over my career, and then 4 years ago, I decided that we needed to change Republican orthodoxy on climate, that denialism was no longer acceptable. It wasn't consistent with my personal views about being responsible about risks. I thought that the evidence of climate change was no longer just scientific, but it was becoming real in people's lives. And I also thought that the solutions the left was proposing were inconsistent with my values, and yet my team wasn't participating. So that's what made me go from working in a number of different areas to working at the Alliance for Market Solutions and saying there has to be conservatives have to engage on this issue. We have to acknowledge reality, and we have to come to the table with our own solution set. And we've been at it for 4 years. That's what I do. I stopped counting at the end when I finished our annual report at the end of last year, but at that point we've had 600 meetings with Republican members of Congress to talk about climate change and climate policy. That's the background, and that's what brought me here tonight. I'm delighted that you would let me come and talk with you. So thank you.
That's a fascinating backstory. I'm curious, whenever you were having this huddle with these scientists back in the 90s and they were saying, like, look at this weird data that we're seeing, what do they call it? I mean, at that point, climate change as a term wasn't really in vogue. I'm not even sure if it had been invented yet. And I don't recall, I mean, I think global warming was around, but what did they refer to it as? What do they think that they were seeing?
I think they may have called it global warming back then, but like the terms weren't as politically laden as they are today. And one of the things that they pointed out was that the effects vary from different regions of the world. So these weren't people who were worried about what the politicians were saying. These were analysts who were thinking this is going to have different effects in different parts of the world, and we're going to see all sorts of impacts on things that are sensitive to temperature and humidity and weather patterns. They also were very interested in doing long-term modeling. So not, what's going to happen this year and next year, but over the next 100 years, what sort of modeling is going to happen. So I think, at that time we were talking about hydrodynamic models and how we were doing verifications of whether the modeling was right. I think now, here we are 20 some odd years later, I don't think there's much question about that. And the whole conversation is much more political. So now you have to think about what exactly terms are you using, and are those left of center or right of center terms? I don't think the climate actually cares how we refer to what's going on.
Right. And when you said, in terms of your values as a conservative, being responsible about risks, that seemed like something that was very personal to you in terms of how you identify as a conservative. Do you mind just expanding a little bit on that and what you mean by that, being responsible about risks, and how this fits in?
Yeah, so John, I'd be delighted to. I think one of the things that Republicans and conservatives have to do is we have to constantly assess our values and how we apply our personal values to political and policy issues. For me, it in particular came to head when at first when I was at AMS, I was frustrated that when reporters would write stories about climate, they would quote environmentalists and conservative Republican climate change deniers. And I wrote a memo one time that got out into the press, and there's some stories where I said something, and I don't remember exactly. I said, I am conservative. I overinsure my cars. I overinsure my life. I've oversaved for my kids' college. I go to church every Sunday. I am risk adverse, and I am worried about the risks associated with changing climate. The correct application of conservative values to climate change is to seek to mitigate risk. That's my sort of core value that I bring to this issue. For me, I want to understand things like, should we be spending infrastructure money on facilities at sea level? What's going to happen to that over time? What are the consequences to the National Flood Insurance Program of rising seas? I'm also worried about business aspects, like how do property and casualty insurers estimate what risks are going to be in the future, right? Are historic property loss models applicable to future risks? The answer is no, not necessarily. There is a change in the loss rates associated with climate-driven issues. So for me, it's that set of issues. There have been conservatives in the past who have said that Margaret Thatcher has a great speech at the United Nations about 31 years ago where she makes the conservative case for engaging on climate. If you're on my email distribution list, I send it out every year on the anniversary of that speech. So I think that there certainly have been conservatives who've applied values similar to mine to the issue of climate in the past. I think we went through a period of years where denialism was what most Republicans talked about, and I think now it's changing. I think there's been a fairly significant shift in the last few years. A lot of conservatives are now willing to talk about the issue. They're struggling with what the correct policy response should be. What should the government do? What can the markets do to address this? And also, what's the scale of the problem? When I started this 4 years ago, there were a number of Republicans who no one had gone to talk to about climate change because environmentalists weren't talking to them about it. Corporations were lobbying them on different issues. I think there's a tremendous advancement among conservatives' understanding of climate. Still, for some, it's awkward to talk about. But I think we're making a lot of progress on this issue. And I will also add a lot of Republicans that we talk to and do some polling work are seeing that whatever they think about the issue, voters they depend upon, particularly young college-educated and women voters, care about this issue. And in purple districts, we as a party have to appeal to those voters, and particularly when I'm talking to members of the House leadership and others who aspire to get back to the big offices over there because they don't like being in the minority. They know the path to the majority runs through purple districts, and the same for control of the Senate. So the political folks have come in, and there's a much bigger community. I mean, you've had quite a list of sort of the echo right people who I work with and see around. We're moving the needle on this issue.
Yeah, you are. The formation of the Conservative Climate Caucus in the House was a watershed moment, I feel like, for the eco right, something that we hardly thought was possible 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think John Curtis deserves a great deal of credit, not just for forming that caucus, but also he has gone and had meetings with a lot of Republican members to get them comfortable with joining that caucus. I think they have over 60 members of the House now in it. And it will be an important forum for conservatives to talk about sort of the value issues that you just asked me to talk about what do we think the problem is and how do we think we should go about it. I do think, and at some point, I hope I'll get a chance to share with you, one of the things I do when I talk to Republican members is I always start with a bit of the science. I think they need to have a grounding on what the climate reality is. And we always spend a few minutes on that. And then we segue into, okay, if that's the reality, what do we as conservatives think we should do about it?
Yeah. So thanks for all that overview. It's really fascinating. I'd love if we could pivot and have you just explain to our audience, since AMS is focused mostly on a carbon tax as this conservative solution, something that's consistent with conservative values. Do you mind just explaining to everybody, like, what exactly is a carbon tax? Why do you think it would be effective, and why is it consistent with Republican values? Yeah.
So, John, the first thing I'll do when I start talking about a carbon tax is I will acknowledge that I am a conservative Republican and I am talking about taxes. And I get that that's a difficult conversation. I am reminded, somebody will remind me, usually fairly impolitely, that this country was founded in a tax revolt in Boston Harbor. It is, we hate taxes, right? I mean, we do hate taxes. And I assure you, I hate taxes as much as anybody else. But I'll just give you a brief sort of tax 101. So the US government collects $3.5 trillion in taxes every year, principally on income, and corporate taxes. And we spend, before the pandemic, we spent about $4.5 trillion a year. So sort of our baseline fiscal indebtedness was $1 trillion a year that we were adding to the debt. Now, that number has expanded dramatically. As a matter of fact, let me just show you something. I was going to do this later, but can I show a couple of charts about what our fiscal condition is? Does that work for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so hold on, let me hide what I did have up here. All right, with any luck, you are now looking at, and hold on, let me get this a little bigger. Okay, Am I good? Can you see that?
I can't see it.
So let me. Well, hold on just a
Are you hitting the share button?
I am hitting the share button, but I'm also trying to make my screen bigger at the same time here. Are you able to see it now?
Yeah, now you're good.
Okay, so 2 slides. Sorry, I'm displaying it in not in the best view, but you will see here, if you can see my cursor, we were running deficits of about $984 billion a year pre-pandemic. Pandemic deficit last year was $3 trillion. That's on $3.5 trillion in revenue, so it gives you a sense of the scale of things. And we were showing long-term deficits of, call it $1 trillion, but going up to about $2 trillion in 2031. Also, here in stop signs, we have a number of major trust funds going insolvent in the coming years. Highway Trust Fund, Medicare goes insolvency, Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation goes insolvent. So I would contend just pre-pandemic serious structural issues. If you then add in some of the things that Democrats are thinking about proposing. So when earlier this year, the Congressional Budget Office was asked to model the fiscal outlook, if Democrats spent $2.7 trillion on the American Rescue Plan. Now we hear the announcement today that Bernie Sanders and the Senate Budget Committee have an agreement to go $3.5 trillion. So what I will tell you is this chart is better than what the Democrats are talking about today. But you will see that we're looking at deficits of $3.5 trillion on $3.5 trillion in revenue. So total expenditures about $7 trillion in 2021. And you will see that these deficits now, while it used to be that we thought about long-term deficits of $1 trillion a year, adding to our current debt of $28.5 trillion a year, now you're looking at getting close to $2 trillion a year of annual deficits being added to the debt. I'm pretty close to terrified about that. My view is that we may be approaching a situation in this country where our policy leaders don't talk about our fiscal condition until it becomes the only thing that we can talk about. I am quite concerned that we don't currently have a demonstrated ability to address our long-term fiscal indebtedness. So this to me is like a car. Not only is it not slowing down, but it doesn't have a braking system in this car right now. So keep that in mind when I talk about tax policy, right? We're collecting 3.5 trillion. We're structurally spending 4.5. It looks like we're structurally going towards 5.5 with deficits of $2 trillion a year on trust funds going insolvent. And incidentally, individual tax rates, the Republican tax cuts expire in 2025. So even with what I'm showing you, tax rates are expected to go up in 2025 and 2026. To me, it's a pretty grim long-term fiscal situation, unsustainable fiscal situation. Our contention is that we have to do significant fiscal reform, and that as we do that, we should think about reducing taxes on earnings and income. As a conservative, I do not believe we should tax those activities that we think are beneficial, that lead to long-term economic growth. So understand, I believe from a tax perspective, we should be shifting taxes over onto the income side of the equation in order to reduce the tax rate on earnings or income, or to be realistic, given the long-term fiscal condition, to at least avoid taxes on earnings and income becoming truly punitive and dampening long-term economic growth. I'm concerned that we are on a track over the long term to increase tax rates, decrease the economy, just at the time when we really need to be increasing long-term economic growth. Let me turn off my screen sharing here so we can get back to looking at each other. At the same time, I believe we need to address climate. One of the real concerns I have is that the Democrats' proposals to address climate are twofold. Either to subsidize activities they like. We spend about $15 billion a year in tax expenditures to production tax credits and investment tax credits for renewable and low carbon technologies. I believe, A, we don't have that much money that's available for those sorts of activities. And secondly, given the size of the energy economy, we're not actually fixing the climate problem when we spend that money. Yes, we've seen increased deployment of wind and solar and other things, but we are not at the scale necessary to solve our climate situation. And we don't have the financial resources right now to just spend our way out of the climate situation. The other alternative that Democrats have in mind is a regulatory approach. I think regulations are truly a horrible way to address climate. And I'll just give you one example. Regulations tend to freeze technology. Administration issues regulations, companies protest, they go through a rulemaking process, eventually they go through a court process, eventually a set of regulations get agreed to, for example, on the operation of new power plants. Those tend to get locked into place for a long period of time. They are, one, inefficient because they don't reduce emissions in the highest cost area. And secondly, they lock that technology solution in for a long time and unfortunately actually block innovation in an arena where we very much need innovation. We need to encourage innovation. So I believe the conservative approach to solving climate change is to price the externality of carbon pollution. Entities that pollute pay a charge. They therefore have an economic incentive to avoid that externality. One of the things I do when I talk to people about a price on carbon, a carbon tax, is I'm very blunt about we need this. We need to price the externality. Here's a price range, $35 and up a ton. This is how we should phase it in. I also encourage people, once it gets into place, do everything you possibly can to avoid paying the tax. I mean, the ideal is that there's a price that correlates to the externality, and everyone across the economy has an incentive not to pay that tax. That's the kind of taxes I like, the ones you can actually avoid. And I assure you, if we put a price on carbon, I won't even clean my grill by just turning it on and letting it run hot for a while, right? Everything will be optimized to avoid paying the tax. That to me is how you create a market for low carbon technologies, low carbon practices. It's the conservative response. It also puts the power of consumers in the market to direct them towards addressing climate rather than having tax dollars or government regulations be the answer. So look, it's a tough conversation, but when I talk to Republicans about our fiscal reality and the need to address climate over the long term in a way that's sustainable and consistent with market values, frankly, there's a lot of people who think this discussion needs to mature and eventually we'll get to something like this. It's early days, but I think we're on the right path.
Yeah, I mean, it's counterintuitive to think that a tax would foster innovation and economic growth. But when you actually think about it, I mean, when it comes to avoiding taxes, that's where people get really creative. Like some of the most creative people on the planet are tax lawyers trying to come up with structures and processes to help people avoid paying taxes. So I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, and I also think one of the things about if you come up with a market solution, like if you just think about it, if you come up with a regulatory solution, the market participants want to delay compliance with those regulations, not in an illegal way, but through the rulemaking process, they delay implementation of the regulations. Through the legal review, they delay implementation of the regulations. They want to push that out as far as possible. If, on the other hand, you put a price on carbon and you say this year it's going to be X and here's the index that's going to be associated with it, and Larry Fink has said this recently, which I think is a tremendous addition to this conversation. What will happen?
Larry Fink being the CEO of BlackRock.
Right. So somebody I think most people take fairly seriously. One of the things that will happen to the market participants is they will look at the long-term price and they will pull it forward. So what you will see is entities actively prepare for that price signal and respond earlier and more effectively, also making sure that they're wringing their carbon pollution from the system where it is most economic to do so, not where government bureaucrats have decided they want to put the point of regulation.
So how does this, I mean, that all makes sense, but how does this stack up to other things that you hear being pushed in other corners of the climate debate, like either through the Green New Deal or with folks that say we just need to foster research and development? Like how does this move the needle in terms of actually solving the problem versus all of those approaches?
Well, the first thing, allow me a little bit of a comment about the Green New Deal. So I'm an energy and climate policy person. When I first started reading about the Green New Deal, it was getting a lot of attention. I truly wanted to understand what it was, and I began actually participating in Sunrise Movement Zoom meetings, signed up legitimately under who I am, listened to what they were saying.
How dare you?
Look, I wanted to actually understand it. And what I found was that it did not relate to the way I think of energy policy, right? It didn't relate to what is the Federal Power Act going to do, and what are FERC regulations going to look like, and what's transmission going to look like, and what is our fuel mix going forward, and what are our efficiency standards going forward. My view is that the Sunrise Movement wanted to advance a broader social agenda about jobs and health insurance and education, and realized that there was a political opportunity with climate, because climate was evolved. The politics of climate were evolving rapidly. There increasingly was a need to do climate. So frankly, and it would be interesting to hear them defend themselves today, but I think they saw an important evolving issue and they loaded their agenda onto it. And that really it's an effort to advance a much broader agenda. And there are people who sort of assign malintent to that. I think it was political opportunism, because we are seeing changing views among voters about the need to address climate. We are seeing increased forest fires and hurricanes and other issues. There is clearly a need. And I think the left has done a very good job of trying to leverage their broader agenda on the climate issue. And what I take from that is we need to figure out what the conservative alternative to that is. What's our solution in climate space that is legitimate, that answers the challenge, that doesn't bring into it the broader social reform that the left is trying to link to the need to address climate.
Got it. So back to the question of how does this compare to other solutions? How does it move the needle? What?
Well, look, there are a number of solutions that people are considering, and I may nerd out on you for just a little bit about clean energy standard, for example, which is one of the things that is under consideration right now. And let me back up just a little bit. Prior to 1992, we had vertically integrated monopolies in the United States in the electricity sector that generated electricity, transmitted electricity, and delivered it at the retail level in accordance largely with public utility regulation. Beginning in 1992, we deregulated that, so that in some parts of the country, we continue to have vertically regulated monopolies. In other parts, we have separated transmission from retail, from generation, and we have what generally people refer to as a deregulated marketplace, but we have regional systems as well. We have a multitude of electricity systems. Some on the left have come in and said, what we need to do to address climate is we need a clean energy standard where we mandate how we generate electricity. What I can tell you as sort of from an energy policy perspective is that two things. One, it is really hard for policymakers right now to understand how you overlay a single federal clean energy standard with all of the different marketplaces that are in effect. Is FERC in charge of regulating? Is EPA in charge of regulating? What do you do with a vertically regulated monopoly? What do you do with the power marketing administrations owned by the federal government? What do you do about generation in one state wheeled into another state, not subject to federal jurisdiction? All of these issues, I think, make it very hard to actually legislate a clean energy standard. I also look at where we do it, where individual states have clean energy standards, like in California. And what I will suggest is that the clean energy standard in California has driven changes in that market equivalent to a carbon price of north of $200 a ton. The same transformation of that market could occur at a carbon price of somewhere around $50 a ton. And this is a University of Chicago study that I think is particularly interesting. So one of the things you have to think about is what is the end state we're trying to drive to, and what's the most efficient means we want to do it? And my view is that we can demonstrate that clean energy standards and renewable energy standards are a horribly inefficient way of doing it. The other way that some on the left are looking at doing it, if they realize a clean energy standard is very hard to pass, so they're looking at existing authorities under the Clean Air Act, for example. In the Obama administration, they came out with a set of regulations that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Massachusetts versus EPA confirmed that EPA could regulate CO2 under the existing Clean Air Act authorities. That Supreme Court does not exist anymore. The Supreme Court, it was a 5-4 decision. There are some in this administration who, in the absence of a legislated climate policy, want to pursue a regulated strategy, recognizing it will go all the way to the Supreme Court. I don't think the Supreme Court will rule the same way they did in Massachusetts versus EPA. I think that path takes us on a multi-year, litigious process that in the end is not effective. The reality is that this country has not passed major climate legislation. We do not yet have a consensus on what we want to do about the externalities associated with the use of energy in this country. We need to figure that out. It is very difficult to figure out anything of that consequence in a closely divided Congress. I mean, allow me a little aside for just a moment. There's a lot of people who write these articles these days about Joe Manchin is the singularly most important vote in the Senate right now. Well, I will tell you that in a 50-50 Senate, every senator can take hostages. There's actually 50 Joe Manchins. And I think when you try to contemplate any major legislation, you think about Joe Manchin dropping off on this side, or Ron Wyden dropping off on this side, or Kristen Sinema dropping off on this side, the reality is we have not yet built the consensus on what we want to do about climate. That's one of the reasons I spend a lot of time these days talking to people about, look, simplify this. You have three choices. You can regulate, you can subsidize, or you can price your externality. That's it. There's all sorts of complexity that can be added on top of that, but those are the three principal policies we have at our disposal to address carbon pollution. Did I answer the question? I can go on about that one for a long time. So
no, you answered the question. You had mentioned at some point that you have a tool that you wanted to share with us about that shows the different policy levers that you just described and how they stack up. Is now an appropriate time to introduce that?
Yeah, I think the politics of climate change are very important, and I'm delighted to see an evolution in Republican and conservative politics about climate change. But I also think it's very important that people understand the reality of the science a little bit about what we are facing, the scale of what we're facing. And so when I do meetings with members of Congress, I frequently use this model. I went to an executive program at MIT, not an actual degree program, but I went through an executive program at MIT. I have a great deal of respect for the intellect of those people up there. And so I use this MIT model. It's the MIT En-ROADS model. It is available to anybody. It's online. You can go on and you can play with this model. And I'll just give you a quick guided tour of it. Have you got it up in front of you?
I'm still waiting for it.
Let's see. It says sharing my screen. Is it working? I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to do it again just to see if we get this to work right.
Okay.
Are we there?
I still don't see it.
All right, hold on just a second here. I will confess that I am having I've never used your particular technology before for a call, so I'm struggling just a little bit, and I apologize for that.
It's okay. It's okay. Take your time.
All right.
So while we're waiting for it to load, you say that this tool was developed by MIT.
Yeah, it's the MIT En-ROADS model. You can Google it, and anybody is able to use it. I find it to be really share. We go share. Let's do it. Is this fun? How's that? Have you got it? I guess that's a no, isn't it?
No.
Yeah.
I was actually seeing if I could pull it up on my side. Yeah, I've got it. Let's see if I can share it.
I think I'm sharing it with you now. Is it not coming through?
I think I'm sharing my screen now.
All right. Well, I apologize.
Now you're sharing yours.
Oh, mine looks like a mess, doesn't it?
Wow, we just unlocked the matrix, I think.
We really did.
Let me stop sharing.
Okay, you stop sharing. Wow, I think there's a lag, and I've done it like 6 times, and that's what you're seeing. All right, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna.
Did you close out?
I did close out. I couldn't stand looking at that anymore. I think it revealed all the secrets of the universe or something like that. That was
let me try again.
all right. And look, while we're doing it, I'll just look. I tell you what, we don't have all that much time until we get to questions if there are any. So let me just talk about it, John, for just a little bit.
Sure. Go for it.
The MIT En-ROADS model is an active interface model that MIT has, where you can go through and you can look at what the global mix of energy is, and you can make adjustments to it. So you can change out what the mix. Oh, here we go. Here's a great model. So do me a favor, John, if you'll go up on view, click on view,
yeah,
go down and put it in US units. Okay, you'll see that has changed the screen, showing 6.5 degrees Fahrenheit increase in global temperature by 2100, because when I use Celsius, US policymakers don't know what I'm talking about.
I don't know what that means either. So,
and then click on graphs.
Okay.
And go down and click on impact, and go over and click on sea level rise. Okay, so this is the way I like to show this model with policymakers. You will see the left graph is global sources of energy through 2100. The center graph is anticipated sea level rise by 2100. You will see it shows about 4 feet of sea level rise by 2100. I will tell you, for those of you who aren't familiar with what's happening with sea level, that is not predominantly glaciers melting and other things like that. That is the sea rising, warming, and simple thermal expansion, driving sea level up about 4 feet. And
so that doesn't assume any additional melting. That's just if the ocean is warmer, it expands.
It does assume some melting, but the challenge is that the principal driver of that 4 feet is thermal expansion. The oceans are big, they are deep. It doesn't take a very large percentage increase in temperature to drive an expansion that drives 4 feet of sea level rise. And you will see that we are on track to see a 6.5 degree Fahrenheit increase in global temperature by 2100. And by the way, MIT updates this model sometime monthly as they see solar prices fall, for example. They assume more solar used by 2100 and other things like that. When I work with policymakers, and John, I'll just have you do this, Republicans frequently like to approach this on the left-hand side of this chart, and they like to say, okay, well, let's reduce coal. And you can slide that slider across on coal, and you can see what happens if you reduce coal consumption. And by the way, anybody who's interested can get in touch and we can go through what the assumptions are. You can also increase renewables and other things as you do this, increase nuclear, for example. And you will observe as you do this, it's an abridged version we'll do right now, you see nominal small impacts on global temperature by 100. You see very little impact on sea level rise. Okay.
Yeah. So if I go like no fossil fuels,
yep.
all renewables and nuclear.
Yep.
Highly effective.
So this is what happens when we start talking to policymakers. You have to get into these other two columns to start really having a long-term impact on global average temperature. You will see that you have to go over to the right-hand side. You really need to do something about methane. Methane is 60, 80 times more drives greater climate change than does CO2 in the atmosphere. You need to do something about deforestation. You need to plant more trees. You need to electrify and make as efficient the economy as you possibly can. And then what you really need to do is you need to make sure that the electrified, efficient economy that you have, that isn't also leaking methane and other GHGs directly into the atmosphere, optimizes electricity production to low carbon sources. And that's where the price on carbon comes into effect. So do something really quickly. There's right in the center top, there's a go back circle button.
Yeah. So I just want to point out though, I just put all of these levers as extreme as I could put them in terms of clean energy innovation. And we moved from 4 feet of sea level rise to about 3 feet of sea level rise.
Yep.
Didn't really move the needle that much.
That's right. Because the greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, that is driving the thermal increased temperatures in the global atmosphere, which is driving increases in sea temperatures, which is driving thermal expansion. That is going to happen.
Now wait a second. There's no option on here of what happens if we all go vegan.
There isn't.
Or if we have a guaranteed job for every American, why isn't that on here?
Yeah, well, because the correlation of some of that stuff to climate change is pretty goofy, frankly.
Okay. Somebody should inform AOC of that.
Yeah, I'll tell you,
Her deal isn't in the MIT model.
There's two sliders on here that I do not adjust when I do this with politicians. I do not adjust these two at the bottom center, right? I don't contemplate.
Yeah, those both look
population.
Yeah, population just looked a little bit Malthusian.
Yeah,
I didn't want to mess with that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The Club of Rome guys play with those two things, and I don't do that. I mean, frankly, personally, for me, the real challenge is as the global population reaches 9 billion people, I think we have a moral obligation to ensure that they have access to energy because it has a direct correlation to life expectancy, infant mortality rates, and other things. And I believe we have a moral obligation to make sure we can provide energy on some level so that people can lead decent lives. I don't speculate about population greater than anticipated or some great plague or massive recessions or other things, because I think we have to come up with a climate policy that responds to the moral imperative to provide energy for the population. Look, the bottom line is, in a sort of a truncated view of this, and you can play with this for hours. And by the way, if you go in and you look at these three dots above each one of these lines and click on them, it's the hamburger. You can go in and play with all of the assumptions. The sliders are really simple ways of manipulating this model. If you want, you can scroll down here and look at all of the different assumptions that are made in them. I spend hours on this sometimes trying to figure out how this is working. But for what Republican policymakers, and I believe everybody needs to understand, is the climate question is not as simple as adjusting our energy sources. That doesn't address the problem.
So everybody's dying to know what happens if I move this lever on the carbon price. Shall we?
Yeah. So look, we do this first. Go over and fix methane. I mean, you got to do something about methane.
Okay.
Let's assume you prevent deforestation around the world. Okay. And then let's go move the electrification, both in transport and building an industry, to some reasonable number. And let's assume some amount of energy efficiency. And what you'll see is you're moving the energy towards electricity so that electricity becomes the way in which energy is transmitted to whatever the end use is. And then, so yeah, this is a reasonable set. I'd like to see, because I know we're not going to make it if you don't otherwise, you've got to increase the efficiency of the transportation sector somewhat. Okay.
We'll say it's increased. Technological, some sort of carbon sequestration comes online.
Yep. The problem with that, just so you know, is that MIT assumes it takes a number of years to do that. So if you move that lever, you don't get a 2021 response. You get like a 2040, 2050, 2060 response. So you end up addressing the tail, but you don't get near-term solutions to it. Okay, but this is one of the ways people look at this, and you say, okay, so now I'm generating this much energy. I've got more efficient buildings, transportation. We've electrified them a lot. The way you address all of the energy supply levers in one fell swoop is you move carbon price. Because what that does is that means that the electricity you do generate is going to be optimized to low carbon. And so if you'll move that slider, you'll begin to see what happens. Okay.
Medium carbon price.
Yeah. This and reducing methane are the two most powerful sliders on the MIT model, because methane is its own nasty problem. But really what you're trying to do is, from my perspective, I'm not trying to change coal generation or renewable generation, but I don't have a particular vested interest in any one of those technologies. What I have an interest in is low carbon generation of electricity. And that's what the carbon price does, is it sends that signal through the market, and you will see that all of these generation fuels respond to a change in the price in carbon.
Yeah. So if you look at the energy mix up here, just by setting a carbon price, you're taking gas, oil, and coal and reducing them in favor of renewables is basically what this model's in.
Right, because otherwise, if you electrify everything, all you're really doing is, but if you just electrify the economy, otherwise what you're really doing is you're saying transportation is going to go from gasoline to natural gas and coal and other fossil fuels. So you're doing sort of a like swap. It really is electrify so that the end user is not emitting, doesn't have a tailpipe on it, and now make sure that the energy they're using comes from low carbon sources.
I got to say, this is probably the nerdiest thing we've ever done on a Met Club live stream, and I'm totally proud of that and glad we were able to do it here, Alex.
So I insist on starting a lot of my meetings with members of Congress with this, because a lot of them, somebody's come in and lobbied them about natural gas or coal or methane or a trillion trees or something else, and they've begun to understand how this system works. But it's the interrelation. Like, climate is a multidimensional challenge. Just the energy system is a multidimensional challenge without cutting. And one of the things we haven't done in here is we haven't spent a lot of time on, if the sea is going up at least 3 feet, maybe 4 feet, what do we do about flood insurance? What do we do about adaptation? What do we do about military bases and airports? And we have, as somebody I once had a long discussion with said, what is the correct level of the sea? And I said, well, look, you can have a long discussion about that, but we built a bunch of stuff at sea level. So we have an interest in it staying pretty close to where it is right now. And we have a really serious problem here. One of the things, and I don't think we have time, but I think I showed you in preparations for this, I also used the NOAA sea level rise map. I have a couple of board members who have very nice houses in Naples, Florida. And I just get that the NOAA sea level rise map is fascinating. You pull it up. It's similarly, you can manipulate it, put in an address. And
New York has several colonies down there.
Actually, yes, you do. Yes, you do. You have some expats living very happily in Florida these days. All right, so that's the model, and I know it's nerding out a little bit, but one of the things I think about as a Republican, as a conservative, is I think we have to sort of face reality and deal with the facts, and we have to make sure that our policies and our politics reflect that reality. So for me, that's a good sense of what the climate reality is going forward. Now, by the way, there are other models, and you can manipulate that model and you can show different things and you can change assumptions associated with it. I like it because I realize the people at MRT are particularly smart. But there's others, and I do think that is a fairly mainstream model of what we can expect going forward in climate.
Well, thanks for walking us through that, and for the politics too. I mean, so you touched on the politics and how it's complicated. We have no consensus on what we're going to do about this issue, but. Yeah. I mean, carbon taxes, I mean, as you alluded, it's a little bit of a political lightning rod. I mean, progressives don't like it because they say that carbon taxes are too market oriented. Yep. they'd rather have the big government approach, and markets don't work well. So they don't like it. And then conservatives, as you've said, it's a tax, and we recoil at the idea of creating new taxes. And we've actually had several eco-right guests here on this show who have basically admitted that, yes, a carbon tax would be very effective. Yep. But then they dismiss it because they think it's too politically difficult. And they say, this is a race against time, and we don't have time to debate this for the next 20 years. So what makes you so determined? I mean, you've made this your signature cause. Why are you so determined to advance it? How do you think it ever gets through Congress? Like, what is the path?
It's a great question. I'm a committed Republican who's conservative by my own values. I don't think I do my friends any favors by avoiding difficult conversations. So I'm committed to having this conversation among Republicans. I don't do a lot of public. I don't walk around with signs. I sit down with people and say, look, here's what we're facing. What are we going to do about it? One of the reasons I focus on markets is because I believe markets will respond, right? We're seeing the EU move forward with a price on carbon. On Friday, we're going to see a big announcement about China putting in front an emissions trading system. So they also have a price on carbon with carbon border adjustments so that U.S. exporters and importers are going to begin feeling the price that the EU and China impose on carbon. I believe that over the long run, markets will respond to the reality of climate change. What I'm trying to convince policymakers is that we ought to respond in the most efficient way we possibly can. Regulations are unnecessarily expensive. We cannot afford to subsidize our way out of this. So yeah, it's a difficult conversation to talk about a carbon tax. But I will say, when I sit down with tax writing professionals, like the staff at the Ways and Means and the Finance Committee, they acknowledge that our fiscal condition is going to force a major rethink in the tax code at some point. I think we're going to see a convergence of the need to address climate, the need to address our fiscal condition, and our major trading partners pursuing their own carbon pricing regimes that's going to force a consensus on this. It's really like sitting and talking with a good friend who has a problem and doesn't want to deal with the problem. I'm not going to back off because it's politically difficult. I'm trying to be in the tent and have a sincere, genuine conversation about this is happening. The marketplace is responding, right? I mean, just one little factoid, right? There is now a difference in the interest rates being charged on municipal bonds between how susceptible those municipalities are to climate change. Because
there's a quantifiable and you can attach it to flood risk.
I will tell you that a portion of the mortgages held by Fannie and Freddie have exposure to climate risk that Fannie and Freddie are not taking into consideration. We wrote off almost $30 billion in losses in the National Flood Insurance Program 2 years ago because we are not pricing the risk of flood loss correctly. We are spending substantially more money in responding to forest fires and to hurricanes than we have historically because we have not accurately responded to those changing risks. So to me, there is a market phenomena that is occurring. The real question is, how do we fix it? Do we regulate it? Do we subsidize our way out of it? Or do we create a market to drive a policy that responds appropriately to it? And yeah, it's an awkward conversation, but I'm not doing my friends any favors by not having it.
So you're going around the hill, you're staging interventions with all these lawmakers, telling them not necessarily what they want to hear, but perhaps what they need to hear.
And I do it with corporate leaders. Corporate executives come in and say, I hate regulations. I can't trust your subsidies. You turn the wind production tax credit on and off every year, but all of my purchasing managers know how to respond to changes in prices of goods. If you put a price on the goods that we purchase, we will respond instantaneously. We will pride ourselves on how quickly we respond to a change in the goods that we have to use to produce whatever it is goods that the companies manufacture or services that they provide. From a corporate perspective, this is the way to address it. Don't regulate them. Don't make them subsistence tax credit consumers. Instead, price the externality associated with the carbon pollution that's emitted from something, and they will respond quickly and in accordance with market ways. So yeah, it can be a difficult conversation, but I am one of the very few people who's going out around saying, look, if you can do it, I've got a solution to your fiscal problems, and I've got a solution to your climate problems, and we can put in policies that are consistent with where the European Union, China, and other of our major trading partners are headed.
Maybe that's why you're one of the 50 people changing the game in DC.
Yeah, well, I haven't quite figured out what the criteria were for that one, but the challenge with those sorts of things is making sure you don't fall off the list the next year. But yeah, look, I think the community in Washington knows that our climate policy is going to change. And so they
seem to be awake to that reality.
Yeah. And so those of us who are in this space are watched because people are trying to understand where's the momentum, what's going to break through. Is Alex right that we're going to do something in the tax space or not? And it's a good question, and a lot of people are watching right now.
So I know we're almost out of time, but I have to ask you one last question, which is, the EU had a big announcement today. Where they actually are going to roll out and introduce their own border adjustable carbon tax. They're going to start taxing imports based on a price of carbon that they set, And if there's not a reciprocal tax in the country it's coming from, they will levy it at the EU border. The Chinese and the Russians kind of came out pretty upset. And then I was surprised even the Biden administration seemed to push back a little bit. Yep. You had the statement come out from Janet Yellen saying like, well, there are other things we could do, and this isn't necessarily the only thing we should pursue. What exactly does this mean for the U.S., and what does it mean for you and your mission at Alliance for Market Solutions?
So the EU has an emissions trading system right now that prices carbon at about $71 a ton. That cost is imposed upon certain sectors in their manufacturing sectors, not the entire economy, but on certain sectors, carbon-intensive sectors. They don't want to see their manufacturing offshore. They call that carbon leakage from a climate perspective, where instead of manufacturing something, it just shifts offshore. And they also don't want to see people who aren't paying that premium import their goods into the EU and displace their products manufactured inside the EU. So there is no question that for their own interests, both their climate interests and their economic interests, they are going to impose a border mechanism. It's designed correctly. WTO allows for that. So they're going to do that. So any country that imposes a cost for carbon pollution will, for political and economic reasons, also have a border adjustment mechanism. It is inevitable. It's the way the markets are going to go. I think the issue for the United States is, are we going to be left out of that? And are our exporters to the EU going to be paying a tariff going into the EU? Or are we going to enter into an agreement with the EU so that we have a price on carbon and goods and services can flow evenly back and forth between them? That's my vision, is that the United States, Canada, Australia, the EU should enter into an agreement where we agree to price carbon and low carbon goods can flow freely between our countries. That places a huge amount of pressure on other countries, the Turkeys, the Russias, and the China, to also reduce their carbon emissions so that they can then sell into those markets without paying the tariffs. That, to me, is the way the market drives climate globally, much better than these voluntary commitments that are being done in accordance with the Paris Accord. I mean, we're going to go to Glasgow and people are going to say, we will reduce emissions by X% from 1990 and all these sorts of things. But those are really just, these are voluntary commitments. That's nothing like the drivers of the global marketplace, right? 40% of global trade occurs between the United States and the EU. If the United States and the EU enter into an agreement where they are going to price carbon, that market will drive economic transformation around the world, and we can lead. Or we can be left out as the EU and other trading of their trading partners start to price carbon. Look, what I would love to do is for U.S. manufacturers to go to the EU and say, our steel is much less carbon intensive than what you're buying out of Turkey. The same for our cement and our aluminum and our glass. We have a competitive advantage versus the Russians, the Chinese, the Turks. Let's do this. There is an opportunity here. Or we can be the global laggards on this issue.
Well, and there was the CLC actually did a study that came out recently that said that our steel industry would benefit from a carbon tax because it is comparably cleaner in its production than most steel sources elsewhere. So we would actually get, if we had a carbon tax, it would actually benefit the U.S. steel industry, counterintuitively.
And well, not counterintuitive to me.
Counterintuitively to most people listening.
Yeah. So to me, that is the triumph of markets.
Right.
Price the externality, and then the good performers have advantages in the marketplace. I'm convinced that if we acknowledge what we need to do on climate, price the externality associated with it, American ingenuity and the American economy can actually succeed. And we can prevail over entities that are less responsible about climate issues.
Well, that is a great place to end it. You've been very generous with your time. I know you've got some grilling obligations coming up here soon.
My wife's invited a bunch of people over, so I was making shish kebabs just before we walked in here, and I've done this, and now I got to go back and make sure the table's set and the grill's on, and this is perfect. I love mixing my life and what we're talking about here. John, it's been a pleasure. It's good to see you, and I really appreciate the time.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much for all the time, the candor, and the insights.
I'll just say, if anybody's interested in a follow-on conversation, AMS has a website. Contact information is there. Glad to have agreeable or disagreeable conversations with people. I know you've got a lot of people who follow what you're doing up there, and I'd be glad to engage with any of them. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Night.